What are you doing?
A little help!
I got him.
You are all of you beneath me. I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Puny God.
You know, Loki isn't the only one who has a hard time thinking that he's God. I think a lot of us, we overestimate the control and our ability to somehow manipulate our future so that it winds up into some personal utopia. We think that if we study hard enough, if we learn more things, if we just work a little harder, then all these things are within our grasp. And I wonder, the culture that we're living in, it seems to feed us that message all the time, right? So if you just read this book, if you take this seminar, if you put into practice these 3 principles, if you eat this food, dress this way, then you will be successful. And yet, you can do all the right things and still come up short, right? And then what happens to that kind of a life? Where you constantly live and live and live trying to get a hold of something that just seems to be just beyond your grasp. Or it seems like you're just about to lay hold of it and then somebody else comes along and takes it. It's not fair. You know, I work hard. It's almost like this should just happen. Now you begin to realize, like, okay, it looks funny on a screen, but it's not so funny when you try to live your life that way. And so we've been gathering together now. We just started a series on the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon. He's called the teacher in the book. Solomon, if you've been following along, has had a storied career, right? He's appointed king over Israel and ascends to a place, bringing Israel with him to a zenith that they had never before had really experienced. And now, as a result of that, you begin to see that Solomon makes some decisions that eventually lead to his demise. And it has far-reaching effects on the kingdom as a whole. Last week, we looked at the first 11 verses in chapter 1, and Solomon underscores a very crucial thing for us to begin to understand, that he makes this thesis. He says, everything is meaningless. And the word meaningless, literally, it's a Hebrew word that means breath, vapor. And figuratively, what it's saying is that it's like illusory. You can't really grasp it. It changes so easily. It's transitory. So when you look at life and you think that you could get your hands on it, you could make it serve you, then just when you think you got it right, then somebody sends a flood or a strong wind or a fire. And in an instant, everything that you thought was so secure is now turned upside down. I remember first moving here and experiencing one of New England's power outages during the winter. And I had just come here in 2003, and I think it was like right around 2003, 2004, where we had that one storm that knocked out power for about 10 days. My wife lasted 4. And then she looked at me and said, we're getting out of here, right? But I can't tell you how many times I walked into a room and turned the lights on, as if it was going to change something, right? All the appliances worked. Everything seemed like it was okay, just had no power. What a great illustration of trying to live life without the influence and the power of God in one's life. See, that's what this whole book is about. It's written from the perspective of someone who achieved great things in his life and then came to a conclusion that that relationship with God is paramount if we're going to live life and live it well. And so I want you to turn in your notes page there, because I printed out another part here from verses 1 through 11. One of the things I want you to see is Solomon just finished sharing that generations come and go, but the earth remains the same. And in saying that, he begins to draw a parallel now between creation and then humankind. He says, you look at the earth, it remains the same. You look at the sun, it rises and sets with such great regularity that it rushes along to do it again the next day. The wind, in the same way, it blows north, south, and then it rushes around and it continues its same patterns again. The sea, it says, the rains fall, the seas rise, but then it starts that whole cycle again where that moisture goes back up into the sky and comes down, and it goes on and on like that with great regularity. And it just seems to just be such a cycle that it brings an order to creation. I mean, think about this for a moment. The sun was just 1 degree closer to the earth, we would all burn up. If the sun was just 1 degree further away, we would all freeze up. I mean, there is a design to what God has done. So what I'm saying to you here is, when Solomon looks and he says, I'm looking at all of this creative order, and I see that there is this regularity to it. When I look at mankind, they appear like footsteps on the sand. The waves of the ocean come, and let that happen 2 or 3 times, and then it's like no one even walked on that sand at all. And he draws the analogy of our life. The generations come and go, but the creative universe of God just continues to flourish and move forward. So why does he use that illustration? Because he wants us to know 2 things. One, when we think about the question that he raises in verse 3, and which is the question that is still before us today, and I put it in your notes page. What does a man gain for all his toil under the sun? The word gain there is a word that speaks of surplus. It speaks of achievement. It speaks that somehow or another I ought to get a payback. So he says, so what do you gain for all the work that you put in? That's the question that he wants to know. And one of the things that he says, by virtue of just looking at creation, he says, whatever our achievements are, they don't last. Because the generations come and go. Like it just seems like we're a blip on the screen. So how does that make you feel? You could work hard and you could gain the whole world, and then at the end you could still lose your soul. And the other thing here is, what makes us think that there ought to be a surplus? What makes us think there ought to be a gain? The earth turning on its axis, the sun rising and setting, the wind blowing, the seas rising. Do they get a surplus? Or is it something that in their design just they flourish in the purposes for which they were created? But somehow or another we think at the end of the day, it's like that bumper sticker, he who dies with the most toys wins. Really? I saw this cartoon one time. It was this guy being lowered into a grave, and he was sitting there because he wanted to be buried with his cowboy hat, a cigar, and in a brand new Cadillac. And so this crane was lowering this Cadillac into the ground with this guy perched behind the steering wheel, and all of his friends were gathered around, and the caption there was the friends talking to one another. They said, "Wow, that's living." Really? I don't think that guy's sucking on that cigar or driving that car. So what does Solomon have to say to us today? I want you to look at this passage here, and I'm going to read it to you, beginning at verse 12. He says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on man. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless. Again, sometimes for us, the word meaningless, it carries with it a very negative, like futile, skeptical, cynical kind of, intonation. But the word is really that of speaking, it's meaningless because it's an illusion. It seems like you can grasp it, but you can't. It's like a cloud in the sky. It changes. It's so transitory. And so when you read this word in the text, what I want you to realize is the translator did the best job they could of trying to take a Hebrew word and giving it an English equivalent. But depending on the intonation of those words, we can take them a little differently. So don't get lost in the sense like, oh, he's saying everything is so negative. It's not that. It's just that he's saying when I looked out at everything, it just seemed so transitory, so illusory. And then he winds up with this proverb. He says, what is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness, folly. But I learned that this too is chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Now, the reason why I put that in a table for you in your notes is because I want you to see something that may not be as obvious, and that is he's basically saying the same thing. He's repeating himself twice. It's the same pattern. He talks about his credentials, he talks about an experiment, he talks about its results. And here you see, like for instance in verse 12 as in verse 16, what he's really saying, these are the teacher's credentials. He talks first about his position as king, right? So you can fill that in on your notes. Just his position as king. No, the text says he was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Verse 16, right? I've grown more and increased in wisdom more than anyone who ruled over Jerusalem before me. These are just basically ways of him saying, let me tell you a little bit about myself. And we'll talk a little bit now about why that's important if we're really going to grab some lessons from him. But what he's saying to you is, look, not only was he king, and not only was he superior to all the kings that came before him or that lived in that time, but if you're a student of the scriptures, you know that David, his father, and Solomon are the only ones to say that they ruled over a unified kingdom. So Solomon took what David brought into being and expanded that in such a way that it was at its zenith. It didn't get better for Israel. In fact, after the fall of Solomon, the kingdom will be divided, and then all those little books in your Old Testament are usually prophets that God raised up to talk to the various generations of people who were living in exile. So here is this book now, and it talks about his position as king. It also talks about his prosperity. And he talks about how he's grown in wisdom more than anyone, right? He had more than others. We're going to see a little bit more of that too in the text. But for now, I just want you to think of this. If you read through 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 11, it gives you the background of who this man Solomon is and all of his achievements. When you read that, one of the things that you realize is that his prosperity wasn't just in terms of goods, of monetary things. He was rich in all kinds of experiences. He understood something about trade and commerce because he was wheeling and dealing with all the nations that were around him. He understood something about diplomacy. He understood something about construction, about foreign affairs. Other rulers would come to Solomon. Queen of Sheba, one of the most famous ones in 1 Kings chapter 10. When she comes, she says, I heard about your reputation, but now seeing it, it's beyond anything anyone could imagine. Not only are you superior in wisdom, but you have more than any of the kings. And so the Queen of Sheba is coming to Solomon to get advice. I want you to think about this other thing here. It talks about privilege. If Solomon has all of this wisdom, a God-given wisdom, if he is given opportunity now, unhindered opportunity, because he's king. When you combine that with his position and with his prosperity, is there anything that this guy can't do? See, most of us, we're limited by time, right? You're limited by finances sometimes. You're limited by your opportunities at work, whatever. It just seems like sometimes things are just a little bit without your reach. When someone wins the Powerball, what's usually the first question someone asks when they put a microphone in front of them? What are you going to do now? And then they start like, well, hey, one thing is I'm not going into work tomorrow, right? Or I'm going to buy this house, or I'm going to buy this boat. But if you just won like $550 million, like I think you could buy a couple of houses actually. So then after you bought the couple of houses, then what? And then when you have now all this luxury on your hands, that not just in the goods, but luxury of time, do your friends have that? And then you turn around and they're your friends that you grew up with your whole life, and now you're saying, look, I just want to love on you a little bit, so come on, I'm going to give you some money so you can come with me. They might do that at once, right? But then they got jobs. They didn't win the Powerball. So what happens? Yeah, sometimes those friendships, they begin to fall away. There's an adversity of having great wealth too. But all I'm trying to say is in these passages, you're presented with a man who has position, prosperity, and privilege in a way that no one else has had, and now he's able to do pretty much what he wants to do. And what he said he wanted to do was, in those tests, is to do three things: to see what good there was for man to do under the sun, which is under the sun, or has everything to do with life in this world, right? So it has everything, these three experiments have everything to do with world, and it has everything to do with wisdom, and it has everything to do with pleasure, as you're going to see in chapter 2. So this king now, who had opportunity and wealth and position to do whatever he felt like it, now he begins to experiment to see what good is there for man to gain under the sun for all of his toil. And so he looks at the world, he looks at wisdom, and he looks at pleasure. So I wanted to spend our time today talking a little bit about that. Let's talk about the results of his search, right? The results there, when we look at world, right? He ends his little talk here with this proverb in verse 15. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. When you look at that proverb, two things come to mind, I think. One, if something is twisted and it can't be straightened, it says that there's something unsatisfactory about this condition. Something's just not right. I wish it was straight, but it's not. It's crooked. And the other one is, what is lacking cannot be counted. It's saying that it's empty. You can't count what's not there. Have you ever felt like that in your life, where, oh man, that promotion is just out of your reach? You have it in your head that this one thing would really make me happy, would solve all my problems. If I just was in this position. You see, it's just right out there. Just what is lacking cannot be counted. What is crooked cannot be straightened. Now, when you read that, it becomes something that's kind of cynical, right? It's just negative. But I'm going to tell you that the word God appears more in Ecclesiastes than the word meaningless. And there's a reason for that. Because Solomon is writing so that we would get a heads up. And one of the things that he's trying to teach everyone here is where you ought to be looking. There was in everything he attempted something crooked that couldn't be made straight. something deficient that couldn't be rendered complete. There was always something to render the happiness that he sought unattainable. So I want you to look at this verse, and you can write it down in your notes. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Because I think it gives you a little bit of an insight into what that proverb is really saying. It says this, it says, consider what God has done. Who has done? God. See, God now is brought into this equation. He says, consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, a man cannot discover anything about his future. If we could, we try to figure the whole thing out. But here's the truth. You'll never have that kind of information to figure out the end from the beginning. That knowledge is only to be found in God. You make your best guess, you make your great estimates, but how about if what you're chasing is the wrong target? And here you have Solomon now, who had everything and every ability to do it, and now he's telling you, look, there are some things that can't be straightened. Why? Because they are beyond your ability to conform them. You could plan a great future, and then a flood happens. Now what? Remember back in the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, when we had this great crash? How was everybody's 401ks doing? It doesn't take much. A chubby little guy in some other part of the world making a stupid decision, and it impacts the rest of the world. And you had no choice in that. You had no say in that. We're going to talk about what do you learn from those things then that are not negative. See, Solomon's proverb was just that, saying there are some things that are so crooked and some things that are so lacking that the only way to get out of that situation is through the intervention of God. God has to show up. So if the first experiment brings us to that place, then he said, okay, I'm not going to just see what's good for man to do under the sun, right? What can occupy his time in this world. I'm going to look at wisdom now. Maybe wisdom will give me the key that I need so that I can live a much better life. And notice what he says at the end here. He says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. There's another contemporary translation of the scriptures. It's called the Good News translation. It says this. It says, the wiser you are, the more worries you have. The more you know, the more it hurts. You've heard the expression, right? Ignorance is bliss. Except when the ignorance places you in harm's way. Then it's not bliss anymore. You could turn a blind eye to things. Doesn't make them go away. And so what Solomon is saying is that at the end of his search for wisdom, trying to find the key to make sense of his world, he came to the conclusion that with all the wisdom, it just brought sorrow into his life. And the more knowledge he had, the more grief it brought. Why? Because he couldn't straighten what was crooked. He couldn't fill up what was lacking, no matter how smart he was. That's why wisdom does two things really in this proverb. The first thing it does is it reveals how difficult life can be. It's hard to make the things straight. It's hard to fill in what's lacking. Some of you are younger and you're trying to figure out your career path and you're trying to put some steps together. It's hard, isn't it? It's sometimes like if you have in your head these goals and then you're not tracking the way you think you should be tracking, and then you start looking at other people who are less talented, less good looking, because you guys are really good looking. You know, like they don't have half of the talent you do, and how come they're getting ahead? Then maybe sometimes you might even think about, well, maybe I'm going to get ahead and I'll just like short circuit this and do my own thing. And then that blows up too. Or some of us are now, you know, we're a little older and you look back and you think, oh my gosh, man, I did all of this And now that I got the little brass ring, it doesn't seem to be as satisfying as it promised. So wisdom brought Solomon to the place where now he really looks and sees how difficult this is. Because he probably didn't believe it. He probably thought, I can fill in what's lacking. I can straighten what's crooked. And given all of his resources and all of his time and all of his prosperity, he couldn't do it because God was the one who was behind it. And the other thing is, one of the other things that wisdom does is it exposes our illusions. See, like Solomon had to come to that place where he recognized, I can't do this. How humbling is that? Because we think, man, we're the captains of our own fate. I can make this happen. Really? Maybe we're protesting like Loki. I'm a god. Yeah, no. Puny God. Because you can't straighten what's crooked and you can't fill in what's lacking. So now you sit there and you think, all right, great. Well, that wasn't really that helpful. Because I don't want to stay in that space. But listen to me. See, this is where this whole book of Ecclesiastes really turns. Because before Solomon is going to give you the prescription, he's got to make sure that you understand that you need to take this medication. You're not going to swallow this pill unless you have to. And as long as you're holding on to the fact that you have it within yourself to do what you need to do, you are not going to do it. You're not going to take the pill. So Solomon is going on and on right now trying to say to you, look, I had a position and privilege and opportunity beyond anyone. And I'm just telling you, even with the God-given wisdom that he gave me, it still made me short. And all I saw was the difficulties of life and how we're powerless, man, to change some of it. So then what does he say? He says, well, that if I can't do that, maybe I ought to just give myself to pleasure. And if you look in your bulletins, what does it say here in Ecclesiastes 2? He says this, he says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. See, that's why I say the question of what does a man gain for all his toil under the sun is really the question that's before us. So you're going to give your whole life to earning a living and making a life, and you want to make sure that at the end of the days, there's something to show for that. And it has to be more than just material things or some degrees that we hang up on a wall. Because here's the truth. You're never going to take it with you. So I'm not saying that there aren't ways in which we're going to get ahead and there aren't things that we're going to enjoy. I'm just saying when at the end of your life comes here, when you finally look at all that stuff, is that enough to bring a quietness in your own heart? Or does sometimes the very successes that you prayed and worked so earnestly to achieve could be the very undoing in your own families? That could happen, right? So Solomon, let me just tell you just a couple of things here. Let's read verses 1 to 11 and see why he came to this conclusion. He starts off in verse 1. He says, I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. Remember, I gave you a little expansion on that Hebrew word, meaningless. Well, I want to do the same thing for this word pleasure. Because the word pleasure sometimes carries with it something that's forbidden or questionable, like, ooh, guilty pleasures. No, see, this word is also translated in our text. Later on, it's translated delight. It's also translated in other parts of the Bible, depending on the context, as joy or gladness. It's also happiness. So what he's really saying here is, I decided that I'm going to give myself to whatever I think would make me happy. How many people here would like to be on that pursuit? Right? I'm going to chase whatever it is that I think is going to make me happy. But how about if what you think is going to make you happy only brings back more misery into your life? But you won't know that until you've already invested about 30 years of your life. And now you stand in a position where you can no longer party like you used to do, and yet now you found out that it was so empty and it destroyed so much of your life. Because you bought the fallacy, you bought the vapor, you bought that illusion that the grass was greener on the other side of that fence until you had to go and mow it. So here's this text now, and we recognize that he's given himself to do that. Notice what he says here in verse 4. He says, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Ooh, in your Bible right there, like in those notes, underscore that phrase, right? The few days of their lives. Because now Solomon just introduced something. What Solomon is saying to you and to me is, I've lived my whole life, and now when I look at all these accomplishments and everything that I did, I do so now with also the recognition that there are few days in my life. Because like when you're younger, you think all your life is out there. Which, by the way, that's a fallacy too, because I can tell you that in the 35 years of ministry, I've done my share of funerals for kids who were in their 20s. They didn't realize that their middle age was when they were 10. But the introduction of the temporalness of life all of a sudden now gives you a whole nother filter by which you're looking at all this stuff. So you can gain all of these things, and now you stand there and you're looking at them, and you're alone in your house. You're alone in the thoughts of your own mind, and you're thinking, really, this is it? And that's exactly what's going on for him. But look what he did. Verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens, parks. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves. I had other slaves who were born into my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. Not only his own kingdom, but of other kingdoms. Can I give you another little insight into this? I told you to read 1 Kings 1 through 11, but let me just show you one text in chapter 4 of 1 Kings. These are the daily provisions for Solomon's home. He says Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores, which translates to about 185 bushels of fine flour, 60 cores, 375 bushels of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, bucks, and choice fowl. That's his daily allotment. Who is this guy feeding? 1 bushel makes 90 one-pound loaves of bread. Said he had 185 bushels of fine flour delivered every day. That's 60,675 loaves of bread. That's a lot of bread. You see, this guy, he's in a class all by himself. That's the point. The teacher is calling everybody in together and saying, can I share with you what unfortunately took me a whole lifetime to come to understand? And that is even in the pursuit of pleasure. I'm coming up short. He says, I acquired men, women singers, a harem as well, the delights of the hearts of men. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no happiness. And then what did he find? That it was a puny gain. My heart took delight. See that word delight? That's that word pleasure. He says, my heart took delight in all my work. This was the reward for all my labor. So what he's saying, the reward for all of his labor was just that he enjoyed his work. That's it. So it was in the doing. I'm kind of like that. I like doing some projects. I've done some pretty good projects around our home. I mean, I landscaped my backyard. I finished my basement. I learned some really cool things. And when I'm done, I kind of stand back there and I look and I go like, dang, man, I did that. And my wife would say, you should have that same experience more often. So I look at her and I go, yeah, but then it wouldn't be special. I'm not going to tell you what she says then. But you notice what he's saying is the only real reward, the only thing that I gained was having done it. And once you've done it, now what? So that's why in verse 11, he says, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was so transient, so illusory, so much like the wind that I found that I was chasing after it. And he says, so nothing was gained under the sun. Where's the surplus? Well, you go back, and there's a lot of surplus, right? The gardens, the palaces, all those things. But here's a guy who's saying, look, I had all that. And I still had to close my eyes and put my head on a pillow and wonder what this was all about. That was it. It's like a bad joke. Can I remind you again that the conclusion of this whole book lies in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, where he says, this is the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In other words, what Solomon is going to come to realize is that a relationship with God is what's going to bring meaning and purpose to one's life, as well as to one's work. You can have knowledge and skills and resources, but when you place them alongside the fact that we have few days, it amounts to nothing more than chasing after the wind. So let me end with this. You may have all the skill and knowledge you need to build a house, but only God can teach you how to build a home. You can have all the skill and the intricacies of this human heart, but only God can give you a heart for humanity. You can earn a great living, but only God can help you to live a great life. There is in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says, many came to hear Solomon. And he quotes in Mark's Gospel that the Queen of Sheba even came to hear of Solomon's wisdom. And then he looked out at the disciples and he says, but one who is greater than Solomon is here. And he was referring to himself. Because the ultimate wisdom is found in the person of Jesus. That's why he said to his disciples, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. I go to prepare a place for you. And where I go, I'm going to come back so that you can be where I am. So why let your heart be troubled. He goes on to tell his disciples, he says, I am going to place my Spirit in you. This gift that my Father is going to give you, the Holy Spirit, it will come and take residence in your life, and it will teach you all things. But you know what that Spirit will do? If we open our lives to the influence of this Spirit, it says that it will bring joy and love and peace and patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. The things that we're looking for in all the wrong places. The things that we could be chasing and giving our life to, only to find out that we're coming up short, is the very thing that God wants to give you as a result of a relationship with him. And that's why when I open up this Bible and I read these pages, I find that God makes a promise. He says, even in the midst of trying circumstances, I promise you a joy inexpressible and full of glory. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want at the end of his day to come to a peacefulness in his own life, to look out and the things that he did, the things that he invested his life in, all of those things come back to him with fruit that says, well done, my good and faithful servant. And that's a promise to every single one who stays connected to the one who gives you life and breath. You can go off on your own. Go ahead, chart your own course, make your own way, be the captain of your own ship. And then when you find it's dry docked, maybe you'll get back to this place where Solomon is. But why do you have to hit your head against the wall? He's saying, look, there's a better way. You know, one of my favorite gospel stories, and I'll end with this, is a father who comes to Jesus with his son who's desperately sick. He's looking for help wherever he can find it. He hears that Jesus is in the area, and he comes and he brings his son because Jesus had already garnered for himself a reputation of doing amazing things. You'd do the same if it was your own. Anything you could do, man, to get help for your kid, you do it. So he trudges through the crowds. He brings this boy, obviously in such great need. He brings him before Jesus. And he says, if you can help him, please do. And Jesus looks at him and says, if I can. He says, all things are possible to him who believes. And then this father, who came to Jesus because he wanted help for his son, looked at Jesus and said, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. That's the greatest prayer in the Bible. Because in that simple prayer, I believe, help me in my unbelief, what you're saying is, I make a puny God. I want to serve an awesome God. I am not he. I need to fix my eyes on him. And he's going to have to help me to deal with my unbelief. So it underscores that nobody in this room is perfect. We're all works in progress. But if you have your eyes fixed on Jesus, at the end of your days, you're not going to be found lacking. So I'm going to pray. And maybe some of you are here today and you never really crossed that line. You never really made that profession of faith. You never decided in your heart to say, you know what? I may still have all these questions over here unanswered, but this one question is full for me today. I am going to live my life for Jesus. Because it'll make you a better man. It'll make you a better woman. It'll make you a better spouse, a better friend, a better citizen. It'll begin to remove some of that inborn selfishness that we have. It'll begin to give us definitions for what love and kindness are really all about. And who's doing that in your life? I hope it's Jesus. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for the soberness by which Solomon writes. I pray, Lord, that we have ears to hear and eyes to see. I pray that learning from him would just accelerate our walk of faith. There are many things in this world, Lord, because they are so front and center. They carry with them this sense of permanence because we can taste it, we can handle it, we can see it. But you're asking us to take our vision and see beyond that because those things will not last. You're telling us to trust you. And I pray, Lord, that as we do in that step of faith, that you would help us with our unbelief. Help us to grow in what it means to be a child of God so that our life now becomes a testimony of what you can do in a person who submitted themselves to your leading. And we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen.